It's my pleasure to welcome you to the University of Missouri School of Law. These presentations, Liberty and Justice for Some, Two-Tier Justice System. Before I introduce our featured speaker, it's my duty, of course, to thank those who made this event a possibility. Chancellor of Diversity Initiative, the Studies, Joan Hermson, the Studies, Gender Studies Department, Social Department, History Forefront, and the Muslim Student Association, Global King of Black Studies, the ACLU of Eastern Missouri, Center Project, our County Professor, the Missouri Fellowship. These are all on the program. I'm not going to read them again. What I will say, however, is this: is that this project is a reflection, if you will, of the collaboration between academics and activists. It is the bridge between the college and the community. This is one of those rare events, in effect, where individuals from the world of academia, the ivory tower, and those who are on the front lines, the grassroots individuals, have come together for this presentation. I thank them for all of their hard work. I thank the ad hoc committee, individuals from not only from Columbia, not only from this university, but nationally and regionally from other organizations. Okay? We determined that we had to choose a speaker, someone who have appeal. Clearly, he has appeal. Clearly, this topic has appeal because of the number of folks in this room. This is a fantastic turnout. In a time when one is labeled unpatriotic for engaging in critical analysis of our government, Glenn Greenwald displays a rare form of courage. If you take away nothing else from this evening, it is important to engage in critical analysis. The Founding Fathers were critical of their governments, and hence the birth of a new nation. The Civil Rights demonstrators were critical of their government, and hence the end of Jim Crow. But if you read Michelle Alexander, of course, there's a new Jim Crow. Women were critical, and hence they had the right to be full citizens and exercise the right over their control over their own bodies. Be careful. And Muslims and Latinos, of course, are critical in the hopes that encroachment on their civil liberties. Glenn Greenwald is a columnist on civil liberties and national security issues for The Guardian of London. From 2007 to 2012, he was a contributing writer at Salon.com. He's the author of 4 books, 3 of which have been New York Times bestsellers. How the Patriot Act, 2006. A critique of the Bush II administration's use of executive power. A Tragic Legacy, 2007, which examines the Bush legacy. And with Liberty and Justice for Some, how the law is used to destroy equality and protect the powerful. Analyzing the entrenchment of the two-tiered U.S. justice system. The other book, Great American Hypocrites, examines the myth-making and exploitation of cultural, gender, and psychological themes by the Republican Party. In March 2009, Glenn Greenwald was selected, along with Amy Goodman of Democracy Now!, as the recipient of the first annual Izzy Award by the Park Center for Independent Media, an award named after the famed journalist I.F. Izzy Stone and devoted to rewarding excellence in independent journalism. Glenn Greenwald regularly appears on various radio and television programs as a guest political pundit. The Columbia-based community radio station KOPN-FM at 89.5 on the FM dial, for one, has featured Glenn's insightful commentaries many times over the past several years. And Chautauqua with host Deb Leach, 6 o'clock, and on Democracy Now! After practicing law briefly for a private firm, he co-founded his own law firm in 1996, where he litigated cases concerning issues of U.S. constitutional law and civil rights. Glenn Greenwald earned a Bachelor of Arts degree from George Washington University and his JD from New York University Law School. He was born in New York, so we'll call him a native New Yorker, but for his Manhattanites, he was actually born in Queens. So not only does that actually count. In any event, it's a pleasure to introduce Glenn Greenwald.
Thanks very much for coming out this evening. I really appreciate it. I'm sorry for the little drama before the event. I hope it was a little exciting at least. And I apologize, and please extend my apologies to the dearly departed who are in the back there. But hopefully they'll be able to watch it on videos. And thank you so much as well to the student and community groups who helped to sponsor this event. And a special thanks to the National Coalition to Protect Civil Freedoms and to the law school, which played a really integral role in enabling my coming here. So the title that was given to the event is With Liberty and Justice for Some. And that is a title that is taken from the book that I wrote and that was released last year. And that is a book that I wrote in order to make the argument that the rule of law in the United States is being not just violated, but explicitly repudiated. And this distinction between violating a principle and expressly repudiating a principle is one that I think is profoundly important. And yet, before I talk about that, I want to talk first about the question of what is it that we even mean when we talk about the rule of law? That's always the first question that I begin with whenever I talk about any of these issues relating to that topic. And the reason I do that is because there are a whole variety of phrases that are extremely commonly invoked in our political discourse that really don't have a very clear meaning. People throw lots of terms around all the time without paying much attention to what it actually denotes. And I think the rule of law is one of the leading examples of that dynamic. It's sort of a cliche at this point. It's something that's a concept to which everybody pays lip service. So you'll hear politicians or people in the media or even citizens all the time standing up and saying, I believe in the rule of law. It's not really a debated issue. You'll never hear somebody stand up and say, oh, I just want you to know that my position on the rule of law is that I'm opposed to it. It's just sort of a slogan at this point. And yet it's used quite frequently, and so I think it's profitable, especially if we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about it tonight, to first ask what it is that we mean by it. And one of the things that first comes to mind from a lot of people when they hear this term, the rule of law, is the famous proclamation by John Adams in the Massachusetts Constitution when he said, we are creating a nation of laws, not of men. And although this is sort of taken on the status of cliche as well, it's actually an extraordinarily revealing and important phrase to think about. Because what Adams is really saying is that there are only two options when you're forming and then sustaining a society. There really are only two choices. There aren't three or four or more. You have to pick between one or the other. And the two choices are you can be a nation of laws or you can be a nation of men, which is, of course, founders speak for human beings. And what a nation of men means is that whoever wields the most power will be able to exert their will without constraint. That's what a nation ruled by men means. That's the nation, the kind of nation that the founders fought an extraordinarily risky war to free themselves from, in which they didn't want to replicate. And so they sought alternatives to living as a nation of men, a nation subject to the will of those who are most powerful, who can exert their will without restraint. And the only option that they could find, the one that they ultimately embraced, was this concept of a nation that lives under the rule of law. So it wasn't just sort of an ancillary concept, it wasn't a slogan to the founders, it was completely instrumental to the republic that they were constructing, to preserving anything that was worthwhile or just about it. And so I do think it's particularly important to look at what they understood by that term and then ask what we understand by that term as well. And even though it's such an important term, it's really not ultimately that complicated of a term. Because really, as I said, all it really is intended to do is to serve as an alternative to living under a nation ruled by men. And the only alternative would be something that is superior even to the most powerful person in the society. Something to which all human beings, regardless of power or position, are subordinate. And that's what they ultimately ended up conceiving as the rule of law as being. It's a common set of rules to which everyone in the society, regardless of power, prestige, or position, are commonly bound. And the reason why this is such a critical concept to them, and why it's such a critical concept to us, is because if you look at what the founders talked about, we talk about all the time about the founders believe this, the founders believe that. It's very difficult to actually think about things in that way because they were incredibly disparate people who were spanning the ideological spectrum and had all kinds of vociferous debates and disagreements amongst themselves on core issues. But one of the things on which they all agreed, probably the only thing that I would say was a really clear consensus, was that the rule of law had to be continuously affirmed as a centerpiece of the republic if it were to make any sense what they were doing. And the reason for that is that if you look at what the founders viewed in terms of inequality, all of them, literally all of them, agreed that vast inequality would be inevitable. There would be inequality in wealth so that some people would be very rich and most people would be very poor. There would be inequality in power so that a few people would be very powerful and the vast majority of people by definition would be ordinary or powerless. And most of them thought not only was that inevitable, but that that was desirable. They wanted there to be outcome inequalities, differences in wealth and position and power and prestige. And some of them, like Thomas Paine, who didn't want that to take place, who didn't see it as desirable, nonetheless agreed that it was inevitable, that there was really nothing you could do to prevent that type of inequality. And so what they all tried to do is to figure out a way, given the inevitability of this inequality,
to at least make that inequality legitimate, to at least make it just. And that's where the rule of law comes into play, the idea that the only way we can accept differences in outcomes, outcome inequality, especially vast differences in outcome inequality, is if we're all bound by the same set of rules, which then legitimize those inequalities. So the way I always typically analogize this is if there's a running race, and everybody starts at the same starting point, and has to abide by the same rules, stay in their lane, or they're not able to elbow other runners out of the way, they don't have any relationship to the judges, it's all at arm's length, we accept that the person who crosses the finish line first is legitimately decreed to be the fastest and reaps rewards, and the person who is the second fastest, and so on. We accept those outcomes as legitimate because everybody was bound by a common set of rules. But if one person were able to start far in front of the other racers, if they were able to kick and trip and elbow other people out of the way, if their cousin or their brother or their parent were the judge making decisions about the race, we would not accept those outcomes as legitimate. We would consider them inherently illegitimate. That's the role that the rule of law was intended to play in America, was to ensure that outcome inequalities, which they saw as inevitable, would at least be legitimized and just in some minimal way, by binding everybody to the same set of rules, regardless of power, position, or prestige. Now, as I started off by saying, there's a huge difference between violating a principle and expressly repudiating the principle. So it is, of course, the case, I doubt anyone in this room needs to have it pointed out, that since the founding, since the inception of the Republic, there have been not minimal, but violent and fundamental breaches of this principle. In fact, the nation was born as one big throbbing violation of the principle of the rule of law. Obviously, we were not all bound by the same set of rules. We were subject to completely different rules based on our position, power, and prestige, by race, by gender, by status, by property ownership, and a whole variety of other attributes. But even when that principle was violated, its centrality was still affirmed. It was still the animating principle of the Republic, and it's what enabled many of those violations ultimately to be rectified. So if you look at the emancipation of slavery, or the elimination of Jim Crow, or the franchisement of women, or greater equality based on socioeconomic status, what you find on behalf of the people who are advocating those changes is an appeal to this principle, to the idea that even though we're going to have inequality in lots of other places, the law, the realm of legality, is the one place where inequality should be unrecognizable, where superiority in power and position and wealth should not be a commodity that makes any difference. It was because we affirmed this principle that we were able to rectify so many of those original deficiencies. So much of American social progress is driven by our continued belief in the principle, even when we violate it in all kinds of radical ways. And so it's extremely important, even when a principle is being violated, that it continue to be affirmed. And the reason I ended up writing this book, and why I focus so much on what I call America's two-tier justice system, is because I don't really think it's the case any longer that we simply violate the principle of the rule of law. I believe that we have actually repudiated it, that we no longer believe in it, that it's very common to hear explicit arguments about why it no longer is a valid principle, especially among the class of political and economic elites, the people who generally tend to exert the greatest influence on our political culture and our legal framework. And I wanted to share a little personal anecdote about when I first started realizing that that was true, although I didn't really fully articulate it as I just did. I sort of started getting the sense that there was something very wrong in terms of how we think about the rule of law. I began writing about politics in 2005. And shortly after, I just spontaneously created my own blog one day without any real purpose or plan or even understanding about why I was doing it. Maybe 6 weeks later, the New York Times revealed on December 15th, 2005, that the Bush administration was spying on the telephone conversation and email communications of American citizens without the warrants required by the FISA law, the law that had been in place for 30 years, that said that it's a felony to intercept communications of American citizens without first going to the FISA court and obtaining warrants. And when this scandal when it first emerged, And I confess this with some degree of embarrassment because I was laboring under a pretty extreme amount of naivete at the time, I see retrospectively. I actually thought that this was going to be a pretty simple scandal. I actually thought, at the very least, that everybody was going to agree that when there's a law in place that says that it is a criminal offense, a felony, to eavesdrop on the communications of American citizens without first getting warrants, that everybody would agree that at least it was a bad thing that the president went and did exactly that which the law says that you cannot do, which is spy on the communications of American citizens. And I thought the debate was simply going to be about what sanction would be appropriate in light of these blatant, demonstrable, and indisputable violations of the law. Would prosecution be warranted? Would there be impeachment proceedings? Would there be some formal censure? I thought that would be the debate. And I remember around this time, this is really the first time that I started doing any sort of media appearances or participating in political discussions and debates on television and on radio. And the reason for that was my work wasn't very well known. I just started writing, but there was very few people who were actually making the argument that what had been revealed was actually a crime and should be treated as such. And so when television producers wanted to have a debate, it was really hard to find somebody who was making that argument. And they would do Google searches, and somehow they would find me, and they would call me, and they invited me to these shows. And I remember I'd gone to these shows, and I had the expectation that it was going to center, the discussion would center on the fact that the president had got caught violating the criminal law. I mean, it's really a criminal law. It says, if you do this, you will go to prison for 5 years, or a $10,000 fine for each offense. It's part of the criminal law. It's a violation of the law, like kidnapping or bank robbery or embezzlement or murder or any other crime that gets committed. So I thought that would be the premise of the discussion. I would go on these TV shows and I would get asked about everything except for that, the fact that it was a violation of the law. So I would get asked things like the topic would be, well, should the Democrats really challenge President Bush on this issue? Won't that be very bad for them in the midterm elections? Or how can anyone object to what President Bush did when it was done to keep us all safe and protect us from the terrorists? And I remember the experience, the sensation that I had. I was legitimately baffled. I was confounded. I was actually kind of confused. And all I could say whenever I was participating in these debates, I just kept saying over and over, I know, but it's against the law. It's illegal. It's criminal, because I actually thought that mattered. And I know, as I said, I say that with a good degree of embarrassment about the extreme naivete under which I was laboring, that it actually mattered if the president broke the law. It didn't. And the reason it didn't is because there was this explicit sense that political leaders who exercise political power, especially high-ranking political leaders, who break the law with the political power that they exercise, really don't belong in a courtroom or the subject of an indictment or being criminally prosecuted. That those kind of procedures are for drug dealers on the street corner or for poor people who commit crimes in order to try and find some method of sustenance. But it's not for our high-ranking political leaders. The very idea that I was advocating, that there should be criminal sanctions, just like there is when ordinary Americans break the law, based on this appeal to the rule of law, that we're all subject on equal terms to the same set of rules, was really treated as though it were radical or crazy or from a different planet. And that's when I really realized that this idea that I had, that I thought was a basic consensus, the rule of law, that we're all bound on equal terms to the same set of rules and guidelines, it was really not something that people believed in. It wasn't just that it was being violated, it was something that had been explicitly renounced. And then I remember at the beginning of the Obama administration, when President Obama was first inaugurated, there was a lot of debate about whether or not criminal investigations would be commenced by the Justice Department to investigate crimes that had been committed by the Bush administration during the war on terror. Things like the construction of a worldwide torture regime, spying on Americans without warrants, lying to Congress about many of these things that lots of legal scholars had said were clearly criminal. And what immediately emerged in the media world in which I was participating in this debate was that it was a virtual consensus again, a Washington consensus certainly, and a political and media consensus as well, that criminal investigations were not appropriate for any of these crimes that had been committed. And the argument that was made almost invariably was not that it's not criminal to authorize torture, or that it's not criminal to spy on Americans without warrants, or that it's not criminal to lie to Congress about the things that had been done. Everyone basically acknowledged that those acts were indeed illegal. Again, the argument that was made was that criminal investigations were inappropriate because people who are sufficiently powerful, who are high enough ranking in political importance, shouldn't be subject to criminal prosecution because it's too disruptive to our society, that it's more important to embrace political harmony and to move on than it is to hold people accountable under the law. Again, it's an explicit renunciation of the rule of law. It's really an argument that those who are in sufficiently high places should be immunized from the rule of law, not just for their good, but for our common good. It's in all of our good to ensure that those who are most powerful aren't subject on equal terms to the rule of law. And that's when it really became crystallized for me just how complete and pure this renunciation of this principle was. Now, one of the important things to note about this is that if this leniency, this impunity, were applied across the board, then it wouldn't present a rule of law problem. So if everybody had the same ability to appeal to these principles that are invoked when it comes time to immunize the most powerful people, if everybody had the ability to seek leniency and obtain it, or seek immunity and obtain it when they got caught breaking the law, no matter what station they are in life, how powerful or well-connected they are, then it wouldn't present a rule of law problem. You can have debates about whether that's the correct criminal justice policy. There are countries in Scandinavia, there are some in Latin America that have adopted extreme leniency as their criminal justice policy. And you could have debates about whether or not that was an advisable thing to do, but it wouldn't implicate the rule of law question because at least we'd all be subject to that same degree of leniency. But that is absolutely not the case. In fact, the exact opposite is true. When it comes to ordinary citizens, people who are powerful or wealthy or well-connected, a completely different universe prevails. So that rather than being able to seek impunity or be immunized from the consequences of their crime, they have one of the world's harshest and most unforgiving criminal justice systems come crashing down upon them. And if you have any doubts at all about this disparity that I'm describing, there's a good way to test it. I wouldn't actually recommend doing this, but if you're really interested in seeing if what I'm saying is true, you can do a test. You can go commit a crime. You can go rob a bank, or you can go and drive at some outrageous speed. And when you get stopped by the police, if the police come to your house and they say, you know, we're here to arrest you because we have evidence that you went and robbed this bank, you can say, okay, look, officer, you know, you caught me. I did that, you know, and I probably shouldn't have, but, you know, isn't it more important that we look to the future and not to the past? Isn't it more important that we think about how to get along harmoniously and prevent these crimes in the future rather than figuring out who should be punished for things that happened in the past? And when you find yourself quickly handcuffed and imprisoned because you don't have license to invoke those excuses, those aren't available to you, you'll see really vividly the two-tier justice system that I'm describing. That was the argument made by first the Obama administration, then President Obama himself, as to why Bush officials should be immunized for their crimes. The Orwellian phrase was constantly invoked: we should look forward and not backward. And it was an extraordinarily bizarre way of thinking because all crimes by definition have taken place in the past. There's no such thing as a future crime by definition. And so if you're really to adopt that mindset, not just for high-ranking government officials, but for everybody, we would open the doors to all our prisons and stop prosecuting everybody. But that mindset was invoked and is invoked only to protect high-ranking people. And so part of what I wanted to do in this book was to take a few steps back and figure out how this began and when it happened and what the implications are. And one of the incidents that I think really pioneered this way of thinking, that if you're sufficiently powerful, you are actually now immunized from the rule of law, was the pardon by Gerald Ford of Richard Nixon. And the reason why I think that's such an important historical event in this development is because if you go and look what happened there, the same type of circumstances prevailed. That is, nobody disputed that very serious crimes were committed by Richard Nixon. Everyone agreed, ultimately, that crimes that he participated in were very serious ones and would be prosecuted had it been anyone else. In fact, lots of his aides ended up going to prison. And yet, when it came time to actually prosecute him, Gerald Ford, who many historians say was selected based on an agreement to pardon Richard Nixon, went on television and had to justify to a very angry American public why it is that at a time when American prisons were overflowing, the most powerful official in the country who got caught red-handed breaking serious laws was never going to see the inside of a courtroom, let alone a prison, because Ford was pardoning him. And if you look at the speech, the televised speech that Ford gave justifying this pardon, you can watch it and he's very uncomfortable and he's very nervous and he's very fidgety because he knows that what he's doing and saying is corrupted. And what he did was he went on television, he said, and he paid lip service to the rule of law, the way that I started off saying everyone does. He said, of course, it's extremely important in America that everybody be subjected to the rule of law, regardless of how powerful. We all agree on that. But he then said he added a but, and the but was essentially intended to gut the very principle that he had just pretended to embrace, and the but was that because of his position, President Nixon has already suffered enough, that leaving office and resigning meant that he was already being punished, and that it was more important for all of us as Americans to be able to band together and put this behind us than it would be to hold him accountable and suffer the disruption and division from having done that. And this was really the template, the rationale that was created, I think for the first time, that constituted an explicit endorsement of ridding ourselves of the rule of law. Americans overwhelmingly were opposed to the pardon, but political and media elites in Washington were overwhelmingly in favor of it, and that rationale became the rationale that now gets hauled out every single time immunity is going to be doled out to our political and now to our economic elites. And so if you look at the last decade, what you find is the most egregious crimes being committed by the nation's most powerful individuals. Not only the creation of a worldwide torture regime, not only illegal spying, not only lying to Congress, but also the systemic fraud that Wall Street tycoons perpetuated in order to precipitate the 2008 financial crisis. None of these crimes, not a single one, has been criminally investigated, let alone resulted in any indictment or prosecution. None of those political and economically powerful actors have been held accountable in any way for the extraordinarily egregious crimes that they have created. What was amazing about the Nixon pardon, and I think particularly meaningful about it, was that Richard Nixon was actually a politician who rode into the White House based on a law and order platform. He spent decades arguing that American justice was too lenient, that we have to eliminate flexibility in sentencing guidelines for judges, that we have to lessen the possibility of parole for criminals, that we have to expand the length of prison sentences. He wanted to put more people in prison for longer periods of time for an ever-expanding range of crimes, and yet this law and order politician, the moment that he got caught breaking the law, was able to be completely immunized. And this is really personification of the two-tiered system of justice that I described. If you look at the United States, and it's hard to comprehensively describe just how sprawling of a prison state it is, but there's a couple of statistics that you could look at to really underscore how the very same politicians who have vested immunity in themselves when they got caught breaking the law have created one of the harshest penal states on the planet. I think the most amazing and compelling statistic in this regard is that Americans are 5% of the world's population. So if you gathered everybody on the planet together, 5% of them would be American citizens living on American soil. And yet, of the prison population on the planet, 25% are on American soil. 1 out of every 4 prisoners on the planet is imprisoned in an American jail. We imprison more of our citizens, by far, than any other country on the planet, just in absolute numbers, by far more than even nations with far greater populations than we have, such as China and India. It's even a greater margin by which we imprison our citizens at the highest proportional rate of any country on the planet. We imprison more of our citizens for longer periods of time for more trivial offenses under harsher conditions than any country in the West by far. So at the very same time that we've created this immunity, this full-scale immunity for political and economic elites, we've created this harsh and unforgiving penal system for everybody else, the very antithesis of what the rule of law was intended to guarantee. And as I said, it's not just that we've abandoned that principle, but you now frequently hear arguments, intended or not, as to why the rule of law should no longer even be applied. I just want to underscore one part of this two-tier justice system that is particularly pernicious, and that is the racial aspect to it. It's pretty well documented, and we heard mention earlier of Michelle Alexander's book on the new Jim Crow, and I'm sure we'll hear discussion of it as well, the panel discussion afterwards, that racial minorities, particularly Latinos and African Americans, are wildly disproportionately punished by this extraordinarily harsh penal state. If you look, for example, at simply statistics showing drug usage, what you find is that white, Latino, and African American youth, adolescents, and young adults use illegal drugs at roughly the same rates, at roughly the same percentages. And if you look at drug arrests and drug convictions, overwhelmingly those are composed of African American and Latino youth who have wildly disproportionate representation in prison. So it isn't just that there's a distinction between ordinary Americans and powerful Americans in the justice system. There's a very racially disparate, and you could argue overtly racist, application of it as well. And we'll talk about that, I'm sure, afterwards. But there's one aspect that has become particularly disturbing over the last 10 years, and that's the treatment of American Muslims in the American justice system. And the reason why that's particularly disturbing is because what you find with Latinos and African Americans and other racial minorities, and certainly the poor, is a very inadequate form of due process. So they are processed through the justice system with barely lawyers. There's places in the United States where people who are charged with felony offenses, where they face prison for more than a decade or several decades, have an average time of 12 minutes with their court-appointed lawyer in total to talk about their case. So there's extremely inadequate due process. But for this other category of people, American Muslims, there's no due process, often at all. They're basically non-persons in our justice system. So in the wake of 9/11, we've seen American Muslims and foreign national Muslims imprisoned indefinitely without a shred of due process. Some of them are now dying off at Guantanamo, basically consigned to life in prison without due process of any kind. You see basic civil liberties like First Amendment rights being abridged overtly as American Muslims are prosecuted for things like putting YouTube clips up that are critical of American policy. And you even now see the Obama administration seizing the power to target Muslims, including American citizens, for assassination, for execution, without bothering to charge them with any crime, prove their guilt, or go to a court and demonstrate the accuracy of the accusations made against them, with almost no controversy, no backlash, no opposition of any kind. So it isn't just that we have really a two-tier justice system, we have a multi-tier justice system in which American Muslims, and increasingly other forms of other people as well who are engaged in forms of domestic dissent and meaningful protest, are being subjected to this sort of persona non grata realm. And I just want to end by talking about what I think are the implications of this repudiation of the rule of law that we've permitted to take root. Because some of them I think are a little bit obvious, and some of them are much less so and take some thinking about, but I think are extremely consequential. So the real question I'm asking is, what is it that happens to a society that decides that it no longer will live under the rule of law, that it will no longer be a society in which everybody is bound to the same set of rules, regardless of power, position, and prestige? And the obvious answer is that you lose the value that I started by talking about, which is that you legitimize all of the other outcome inequalities. So you lose the anchor of legitimacy to the fact that some people are extremely rich and most people are very poor, some people are very powerful, most are very ordinary, because we're no longer abiding by the same rules any longer. Most of us have severe constraints, and then some of us have none. And you see greatly increased dissatisfaction over what used to be the accepted state of affairs in America, differences in wealth, differences in power, differences in prestige, rooted in the fact that there's a perception that it's no longer legitimate because the same set of rules no longer bind everybody equally. But I think there are a lot of less obvious implications to this as well that I just want to spend the bulk of the rest of my time talking about. And I think the important thing to conceive of, to really focus on, is that what law was intended to do first and foremost was provide some mechanism for constraining the people in the society who wield the most power. So if you no longer subject the people in the society who wield the most power, whether economic power or political power, to this constraint we call the law, if you immunize them from its compulsory mandates and from the force of it and from punishments when it's violated, then you're essentially liberating them from any constraints at all. It means that people can act without the constraint of law. They're free to act in their own will, regardless of any rules that as a society we set up. If the government is free to transgress the limits of law, it means that they can do whatever it wants to us, and there's really no recourse. And what this really does, first and foremost, is it creates a climate of fear among the citizenry. It changes the relationship between the citizenry and the government in very fundamental and radical ways. And it's a hard concept to convey, especially in limited time. So I just want to share one more anecdote about that really kind of highlighted that for me, and that I think illustrates the point. I have spent a lot of time over the last few years writing about the group WikiLeaks, the whistleblowing site that has devoted itself to trying to penetrate the regime of secrecy behind which the U.S. government operates and find some way to provide transparency. And I've been a defender of WikiLeaks and have written a lot in defense of them and the reasons why I think they're an important organization. And the first time that I ever wrote about WikiLeaks was back in January of 2010, more than 2 years ago now. And this was a time before they had really done any of their news-making leaks, like the Apache helicopter video that showed U.S. soldiers in Baghdad shooting unarmed civilians and journalists, or the Iraq and Afghanistan war documents or the diplomatic cables. Very few people, including me, had really known very little about WikiLeaks back at this time. And the way that I came to learn about WikiLeaks was that the U.S. government, the Pentagon, the United States Army, had prepared a top-secret report in 2008 that talked about WikiLeaks. And it declared WikiLeaks to be what it called an enemy of the state. And it said that WikiLeaks was one of the few groups that was posing a genuine threat to the national security of the United States. And this report talked about ways that I donate money to WikiLeaks electronically. If I wire them money or send money to them by PayPal, that I'm eventually going to end up on some government list somewhere. Or if WikiLeaks ends up being decreed to be a terrorist organization, that I could even be facing criminal liability for materially supporting a terrorist organization. And so I'm actually afraid to donate money to this organization, even though I support their aims. And the reason this was so striking to me and really shaped what I think in important ways is because WikiLeaks is an organization that had never been, in fact still has never been, even charged with any crime, let alone convicted of any crime, nor could it ever be charged with a crime, because what it does, receiving classified information from government sources and then publishing it, is a pure free press activity. It's exactly what the New York Times and CNN and every other media outlet in the world does. It could never be prosecuted consistent with the First Amendment. And here you had large numbers of American citizens who were afraid of exercising their First Amendment rights, which is what donating money to a political group whose cause you support is, afraid of exercising their right because they know that their government no longer is constrained by law, so that even though it would be illegitimate to punish them or WikiLeaks, under the law, under our Constitution, for donating money to that group, they were still petrified, rationally so, that they would be subjected to punishment if they did so. In other words, you had large numbers of American citizens voluntarily relinquishing their own rights out of fear of what the government could do now that it was no longer constrained by the rule of law. You can offer all all the rights you want on a piece of paper or a piece of parchment. But if you intimidate the population out of exercising them, those rights become completely meaningless. I had the same experience when I wrote for the first time about the government's treatment of the 23-year-old Army private who was accused of being the primary leaker of WikiLeaks, Bradley Manning. And in December of 2010, I wrote an article about how he had been held in extremely inhumane, oppressive, and torturous conditions in prolonged solitary confinement, all without being charged with, convicted of any crime. And ultimately, a UN investigation concluded that, in fact, he was being held in oppressive conditions. And at the time, I remember when I wrote this article, the reaction that a lot of people have, the question that I got asked a lot, and I even asked myself was, why would the US government want to take somebody like Bradley Manning, charged with these crimes, and put him in these extremely oppressive conditions? It seems counterproductive because it turns him into a martyr. It jeopardizes their ability to prosecute him because statements he makes can be alleged to have been coerced. One prominent Obama official, the State Department spokesman P.J. Crowley, actually publicly denounced the treatment of Bradley Manning and then resigned in protest. And so I couldn't really figure out why the government would want to do this. It just seemed so against their interests. And it ultimately occurred to me that the reason they wanted to put Bradley Manning in prolonged solitary confinement under extremely oppressive conditions was the same reason that the government wants to threaten a prosecution of WikiLeaks, even though it knows constitutionally it's constrained from doing so. And it's the same reason that the US government spent almost a decade kidnapping people from around the world and shipping them to a Caribbean island and dressing them in an orange jumpsuit and putting them into cages without due process and torturing them. This is all a way for the United States government to send the unmistakable continuous signal to anyone who might challenge them that we are not constrained by law or any other limits in the things that we can do to you if you oppose us. It's a way of bolstering the climate of fear to keep people intimidated and pacified from challenging them or defying them in any meaningful way. It's what happens when people who exercise power are emancipated from the constraints of law or the constraints of any kind. They are able to put people in fear of their power. And that's the climate of fear that has been created by the renunciation of the rule of law. It's the way that the rule of law really has been, the reason that it has been abandoned, it's the way that the relationship between the citizenry and the government has changed so radically. You see this in so many instances. When I travel around the country and give talks like this at colleges, I typically meet with people in American Muslim communities. You can sense the palpable fear that they have, that if they speak to a new person at their mosque, that it's probably an FBI informant. If they donate money to a Muslim charity, they could be convicted of materially supporting terrorism. They can end up on no-fly lists without any cause or explanation or recourse to getting off. There's a palpable fear in numerous communities that think about opposing the United States government, because that's the message the United States government sends. If you want to expose our secrets, if you want to oppose our policies, look at what we did to Bradley Manning, look at what we did to WikiLeaks, look at what we did to the people at Guantanamo and elsewhere around the world. That is a government that acts without constraints. So the last point I want to make is the question about what can be done about this. And the reason why I like to end with that is because otherwise, what happens is if you gather together at an event like this and you spend an hour or an hour and a half talking about all these really systemic problems and these awful things that are going on, this kind of like gloominess sets in, this sense of like, guys, just listen to this person for an hour talk about all these horrible things, and I think I want to go away in my room and close the windows or jump off a bridge or something. So I think it's important not to breed defeatism. And there's really no reason ever to have defeatism bred, because one of the lessons that we should learn from history, including very recent history, if you look, for example, at the Arab Spring, is that no matter how powerful certain institutions seem, or human structures, how formidable they seem, or invulnerable they seem, the lesson is always that any structure created by human beings can be modified or torn down by other human beings using the right methods. That is indisputable truth. And, I think the important thing to realize is that there's a certain way that the people who are benefiting from this system want you to react to the kinds of things that we're talking about tonight. There was this amazing article in December 2008, right before President Obama was inaugurated, which was really the first signal that he sent that despite all the promises he made during the campaign, he actually had no intention of authorizing or even allowing any investigations into the Bush-era crimes. And this New York Times article, I think unintentionally included this extremely important truth in the middle of this article. It said, the reason why presidents are so reluctant to allow investigations into the crimes of their predecessors is because they know that if they block those investigations, once they leave office, they too will have the same benefit. It's a class-based privilege. So it doesn't matter, Republican or Democrat, conservative or liberal, everybody in this class of political and economic elites has it within their interest to perpetuate this system of immunity, this two-tiered justice system. It protects themselves, and then law gets used as a mechanism of control for everybody else to entrench the status quo. And so the only way that we think about political change being permissible is by going to the ballot box and electing either the Republican choice or the Democratic choice. And what we're talking about tonight will never be changed by that process because both of those parties have the same interest in preserving it. That isn't to say that there's no meaningful change that can happen by voting. That's something we all decide for ourselves. The point is that if any real meaningful change is to take place on this level, it has to take place not within the ballot box and within the process of voting for one of the two parties, but outside of it. Really movements by citizens to say that we're no longer willing to tolerate this radical unfairness. And you've seen the genesis of that movement in pretty substantial ways. If you look at the origins of the Tea Party movement, before it was co-opted by the Republican Party, it was very much a movement that was born in protest of the fact that the solution, the reaction to the financial crisis, was to reward the very oligarchs who caused it by bailing them out and making them richer at the expense of everybody else. And if you look at the roots of the Occupy movement, which I think is probably the most significant political development of the last decade, at least, you see that same template, the idea that we aren't simply protesting economic equality, the 1% versus the 99%, but that the 1% have really removed themselves from the constraints of law, that they are no longer bound by any of the same restrictions or constraints as the rest of us. And those movements, both of them, really began to put some fear, some much needed fear, in the heart of America's elite class. But it was really just the beginning. But I think that template is so important for seeing how that change can be done. When people who exercise power don't fear the consequences of abuse, they will continue to abuse it. It's only once they begin to fear the recriminations that only the rest of us can provide will they cease engaging in that behavior. And that, to me, is really the principle that animates how this change has to take place. So with that, I thank you very much for coming and for listening.
While we are transitioning, we'll take a few questions now. Then we'll get transition up. So, questions for Glenn Greenwald? You're here.
What is the legal profession doing about this? I mean, we have prosecutors brandishing guns, saying how many people they've lost away. Nothing being done about prosecutorial misconduct. There are so many bar associations and law firms. What is happening about this? Why is nobody talking about that? What is the profession doing?
Yeah, I mean, very little, unfortunately. I mean, I think you see, there are certainly organizations that from the beginning of, say, September 11th have been very stalwart about opposing these kind of abuses. Of course, the ACLU, the Center for Constitutional Rights, and others have been pretty assertive from the start in a very principled way. And once it became safe, you then began to see law firms doing pro bono work on behalf of Guantanamo detainees to defend habeas corpus rights and the like. But I think the bigger problem is not so much the legal profession, although it is. It's really the federal judiciary. Because it's the federal judiciary that really is supposed to provide the refuge of last resort to people who are being persecuted by the political branches because they're unpopular and powerless. That's why they have life tenure, that's why they're immunized from elections. And what you see in the federal judiciary is really extraordinary. The most amazing fact to me is that it isn't just that, say, if you look at the war on terror abuses, the people responsible for those crimes have to be prosecuted or held accountable. What's even more amazing is that the victims of those abuses, people who were tortured even though the government acknowledges they did nothing wrong, people who were rendered to Syria and tortured by mistaken identity, people who were in prison for years without charges and then exonerated, have tried to sue in American courts for some form of redress, and federal courts uniformly have slammed the courthouse doors shut in their face, not even allowed them to have their cases heard, let alone seek justice, even when they were able to do so elsewhere. And you see this in the criminal context as well. Federal judges continuously siding with the government over criminal defendants. It's become an institutionally biased branch of the government that rather than checking the federal government has really become a decline enabler. And I think that's one of the most significant problems in all of these issues that we're discussing is that the institutions designed to check these abuses have become complicit.
Go to the side.
Seems that any number of federal judges missed their day in class with regard to Article 6, Paragraph 2 of the U.S. Constitution. We just had a situation here at Whiteman Air Force Base where 3 people tried to engage in civil resistance and deliver an indictment of the commander of the post for the drone crimes. When they went to court, Attorney General Ramsey Clark came to Jeff City. He was not allowed to testify regarding Nuremberg, Geneva, etc. Do you see this in your travels?
Well, I mean, a couple things. I mean, one is the problem with federal judge, it's a complex problem, and you don't want to overgeneralize. There are a lot of very good federal judges who have actually stood up to the federal government. There was just a recent federal judge in New York who permanently enjoined the indefinite detention provisions of the NDAA, the law that was passed by Congress at the end of 2011, authorizing indefinite detention of American citizens. The problem is that federal judges are put through a very rigorous process in Congress and selected by the president, where they're basically people who are institutionally and culturally biased toward authority. So the people who work in large law firms and defend corporations, or who come from prosecutor's offices, or who have otherwise demonstrated their fealty to the status quo. Very few of them make it through that process unless that happens. So you have large numbers of federal judges devoted to that as an ideology. And then on top of that, the idea that anything like treaties or any kind of foreign conventions has any impact whatsoever on American law, even though, as you say, the Constitution declares it to be the supreme law on par with statutes and everything else, is considered a far left-wing radical concept and will get you laughed out of court rather than any sort of remedy.
We'll take this last question over with the panel, and then there'll be time for questions after the panel is left. So.
Yeah, earlier you mentioned that you don't really foresee any solving our problems through continuation of red versus blue and voting booth. Do you think that would be a worthwhile response to a rejection of that system to hop on the train and support a third-party candidate such as Gary Johnson, who will be on the ballot in most, if not all, states?
I mean, I think everyone has to make that decision for themselves, and part of it depends, I think, a lot on where you live and what the impact of doing that will be. I think it's a lot easier to do that if you're in a state where the outcome is guaranteed than if you're in one where it isn't. But I think ultimately the dynamic that always has to be weighed is every election gets decreed to be the most important ever, which is a way of ensuring that you never, ever consider any option other than voting for one of the two parties. It keeps you locked into that system, this mythology. And really what ultimately has to happen is, it is generally true that in every single election there are minimal differences between the two candidates. And these minimal differences, I don't mean to trivialize them, can have very important impact on the lives of lots of people, so they're not easily dismissed.
So that short-term impact of your action has to be weighed against the need for midterm and longer-term reform so that we don't constantly end up beholden to the same system. So if we keep continuously pledging fealty to it, it'll perpetuate itself forever. And how that gets weighed, the willingness to sacrifice some short-term harm for longer-term reform, depends on a whole bunch of different circumstances. I think everybody has to weigh those priorities for themselves.
Well, thank you.
Okay.
Now our panelists will respond, will comment, will add their own thoughts, and we'll Q&A afterwards and so forth. To my far left, Eduardo Crespi. He's the executive director of Central Latino, which he founded 12 years ago. It's an organization committed to empowering immigrants, helping them get settled in the Columbia area. For the past few years, under Eduardo's leadership, Central Latino also initiated the Comedor Popular, or People's Diner. God, my Spanish is terrible, sorry. I took French in high school. Which he will talk more about during his comments. It's located in the Labor Temple on Gar Street. Eduardo is also a registered nurse specializing in public health. And in 2003, he worked with the National Library of Medicine in Washington, D.C. He currently works for the Heartland Self-Equity Council, which is committed to address and end health disparities among minority populations. And the council is an initiative of the U.S. Office of Minority Health within the Department of Health. And Eduardo immigrated to the United States from Argentina 21 years ago. Our next panelist, Amani Hacking, and I'm hoping I pronounced that correctly.
Very good.
All right. Is an assistant clinical professor and supervisor of the externship program at the St. Louis University School of Law. She teaches lawyering practice and traditional ethics and court procedure in the legal clinics program and has taught an Islamic law seminar, all since joining the SLU faculty in 2007. Professor Hacking is a member of the Center for International and Comparative Law and is co-founder of the St. Louis chapter of the Council on American Islamic Relations. She has written and spoken extensively on Muslims and Arabs in the United States. Prior to joining the SLU faculty, she practiced law at 2 private firms focusing on complex civil litigation and appellate advocacy. And while in private practice, she received the David J. Dixon Award for Excellence in Appellate Advocacy from the Missouri Bar Foundation. Amani received her bachelor's degree from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, her JD from St. Louis University in 1997, where she graduated cum laude, and her MA from St. Louis University as well. Next panelist, Stephen Downs, is the Executive Director of the National Coalition to Protect Civil Freedoms, which is dedicated to eliminating preemptive prosecution, profiling, and prisoner abuse. He spent most of his legal career as the Chief Attorney for the New York State Commission on Judicial Conduct, disciplining judges for misconduct. He retired in 2003 and in 2006 volunteered to be part of the defense team for Yassin Arif, a local imam charged with terrorism-related offenses. After Arif and his co-defendant were convicted and sentenced to 15 years, Steve Downs became convinced that the U.S. government had deliberately convicted an innocent man in a process known as preemptive prosecution. It changed his life. He soon afterwards became a founding member of the Muslim Solidarity Committee to raise money to help take care of the 2 families and 10 children of the defendants. And when other similar cases of preemptive prosecution were discovered, Steve Downs became a co-founder of Project Salam, dedicated to documenting all of the cases of preemptive prosecution in a database and advocating for the release of the defendants. Project Salam is now following over 800 cases in its database. In 2010, Project Salam became one of 18 founding members of the National Coalition to Protect Civil Freedoms. Steve Downs graduated from Cornell Law School in 1969 after previously serving for 2 years in the American Peace Corps in India, and he lives in Albany, New York. My near left is Reddit Hudson. He worked for 5 years as an officer with the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department, serving on a neighborhood beat with the street crime unit, and as a detective in the intelligence unit. From 2000 to just a few weeks ago, he worked with the Eastern Missouri ACLU. He served as the racial justice manager before becoming a program associate with the group. One of his most significant accomplishments was his principal authoring of Suffering in Silence, an in-depth 2009 report examining conditions at the St. Louis City Jail and focusing on human rights violations, including sexual and physical violence endured by those incarcerated. The report prompted St. Louis Police Department to institute a more proactive policy to curb abuse in jail. Reddit Hudson has been a leader with the Justice for Reggie campaign, drawing international attention to the plight of Reggie Clemens, who has lived under a death sentence in Missouri for about 2 decades. Reddit has been an active and outspoken leader in the struggle to end the death penalty, received his undergraduate degree from St. Louis University as well. is the panelists will offer comments for about 8 minutes, and then they will engage in Q&A.
First, I'd like to congratulate Mr. Greenwald. That was excellent. I mean, that was the most articulate and easy to understand expression of things that many of us in this room, I'm sure, agree with, that I've heard in a long time. And it's good to be in a setting like this. As I mentioned to you before we started, the last time I was in a setting like this, we were discussing racial profiling. My colleague John Chasnoff, who's with the ACLU of Eastern Missouri, is also here. But I was at St. Louis University's law school there to debate Nathan Sales, who broke the Patriot Act. Yeah. So this is a nice change of pace. Let me just say, I am a former police officer. I've been shot at enforcing the laws of this state. I worked in St. Louis, which, if you follow any news media, you know it's a fairly dangerous city. But I resigned my position, although law enforcement is a noble profession. I resigned my position because I was so profoundly disillusioned with the criminal justice system in the United States and the conduct of some of my colleagues in particular. And I'm going to go to the issue of race because I think, that is a layer that you discussed, and it is where most of my work has been focused since I left the department. A couple of 3 or 4 years ago now, the congressman in the district that I live in, the 1st District, Congressman Lacy Clay, convened a conference of law enforcement leaders, chiefs of police from various municipalities in his district, which includes St. Louis City, St. Louis County, and some other places, to talk about the issue of profiling because his office had been receiving a huge amount of complaints. And I remember going to that conference very intentional with what I wanted to do. And I brought a videotape that I had made on the 4th of July. It was interesting to hear you talk about our founders, the principles, the rule of law. I had to take a statement. It wasn't a deposition. I'm not an attorney, but it was a statement that I was going to hand over to our attorneys from a young man named Anthony Collins. He's African American. At the time, I guess Anthony was about 22, 23 years old. And he was describing an incident that had taken place in St. Louis City with St. Louis City Police. He was driving down the street one evening. I think they had set up some kind of a checkpoint. I don't know if it was for DUI or what. They just had a checkpoint where they were randomly stopping cars going through a certain intersection, a certain place. And he arrived at this intersection and was motioned by an officer to, stop, and he was giving him some other gestures. But Anthony wasn't very clear on what he wanted him to do. So the officer, he could see him becoming more animated. He lets the window down. The officer is shouting something at him. He still doesn't understand. So he gets out of his car to get closer to the officer so he can hear his directive and comply. For whatever reason, the officer didn't want him to get out of his car, and he was ordering him back to the car. Get back in your, I won't use the language that the officer used, but it was colorful, according to Anthony. Get back in your fill-in-the-blank car. But Anthony wanted to know what he needed to do because he had some place to be. He didn't get back in his car. The officer gets to him, and ultimately it escalates, and the officer assaults him. And he beats him up pretty good. He maces him up pretty good. Anthony's having trouble breathing. He's having a hard time, and he's been assaulted. A superior officer, a sergeant, responds to the scene. They're about to charge Anthony with resisting arrest. If you ever see that, that's boilerplate for the police whoops you, but we need a charge for you. So you resisted our attempt to arrest you, and something else. At some point during the encounter, he had been refused medical treatment, which he asked for, of course. At some point, I don't remember exactly, but it's been some years now since and I'm showing this, mind you, I'm showing this videotape interview on a screen to a room full of police chiefs and police officers. At some point, the decision was made to allow him to get medical treatment and to allow him to continue on. They unarrested him, if you will. And the point at which that decision was made was when they realized that they were causing him a delay, which in turn would cause him to miss a flight back to Iraq for his second tour of duty in the U.S. Army. But on the tape, to hear Anthony describe that this isn't the first time this has happened to me or my friends, and describe the history of his experience, in many cases the collective experience of minority communities with law enforcement agencies, how he'd been treated from the time he was this big all the way through, even though he did everything right. Great student, great character. His mother was even targeted at various points in her life. He would describe that. And I knew I had done a couple of things. I knew that I had taken away the thing that is usually available to us as police officers when you challenge our behavior, which is our preferred narrative. Wait a minute, man, I put my life on the line every day. If you were ever in my shoes and you had to make a decision like I have, you would ever question anything that I do. I had taken that from them. The other part of the narrative, as you mentioned earlier in your remarks, that if you challenge the behavior of law enforcement in this country, somehow that makes you unpatriotic, anti-law enforcement, pro-criminal, anti-everything that's right and good. I took that from them and forced a real dialogue. When you talk about solutions, forcing a real dialogue at this point in our nation's history, I think the opportunity is there. Everything he said to me was plain truth, simple truth, easy to grasp, easy to understand. The challenge then is what the other gentleman said. What are we going to do about it? What are we going to do about it? And my hope is that this is the generation that first gets more comfortable with acknowledging the complicated history of our country. Yes, it's a great country. Yes, we love our country. No, it isn't perfect. Yes, it's okay to say that. Yes, it's okay to point out those areas where we have been flawed. And race, of course, has been central to that. The way to make that discussion easier, the way to take some of that tension out when we get to those discussions of race, is to acknowledge this, that the conditions you're describing, or that I'm describing, that we have to address, are the fault of no one in this room. We were born into this reality. These conditions pre-exist all of us. It is not an indictment of any white person in this room, for example, for me to criticize the inequities, the severe inequities that are legislated into our laws everywhere. Missouri patting itself on the back right now for finally coming into compliance with the federal guideline relative to crack cocaine sentencing of 18 to 1. And we clap for that, almost instinctively. 18 to 1, that's a good thing. No, it's not. No, it's not. How about equal treatment under the law? How about 1 to 1? But, like I said, it's nobody's fault. Our responsibility becomes to do something about it. And the political leverage that is available to people, not even in those high offices that you described. Let me know when I'm getting close to 8 minutes. 2 left. Not even in those high offices, but the political leverage is available to people, even on the local level, on the state level. Do you know how much political leverage there is for somebody holding office or running for office, standing up in front of people saying, I'm tough on crime, especially in our cities? I did a report, the report you referenced, which was triggered by a young man named Cedric Cross, who had been so brutally beaten in a St. Louis jail. And mind you, jails are where we hold people over sometimes for a trial, which means guilt or innocence has yet to be determined, innocent until proven guilty, who had been so severely beaten in a jail that he crawled out of it upon his release, down Tucker Boulevard, right across from our city hall. If you can imagine an inmate that crawls on all fours down a main street to police headquarters and asked them to get him an ambulance. That's how bad he was beaten. They called the ambulance, taking him to Bourne's Jewish Hospital in St. Louis. The doctors look at him and say, you have to have surgery immediately. His internal injuries were that severe. We report that out into the mainstream, and it's a yarn. Oh, he's a criminal anyway. Look at where he's from. You know, St. Louis is a dangerous city. We got to do something about those people anyway. What do you want? You want them to be at the Ritz-Carlton or something like that? Our reaction. So we have to accept responsibility for first acknowledging the truth that's been presented to us, and then find that courage that's in all of us to actually do something about it. Let's hold each other accountable for making this country everything that we want it to be. And I think we're moving in that direction inevitably. I think just because the population is changing so rapidly that the diversity itself, I think, will force. When the minority becomes a majority, I think a new conversation is going to be forced about who populates our prisons, how our laws are enforced, and how people are treated in every process where we should be equally valued.
Wow, what a great audience. The National Coalition to Protect Civil Freedoms is a coalition of 20 Muslim and civil rights organizations that came together because of concerns about three campaigns: profiling, preemptive prosecution, and prisoner abuse, solitary confinement. And Reddit has given a really good, I think, description of the kind of problem that profiling represents for a large number of people all across this country. We'll all have a pretty good sense of that, so I'm not going to take the time to deal with that now. I want to talk to you about preemptive prosecution and solitary confinement, which is one of our focuses. And I brought with me my storyboard here. This is 150 some odd cases that we are following of this. And it is important for me to bring it because I want everybody to understand that we're not engaged in a theoretical discussion here. These are real people serving very long sentences, 25, 30, 40 life sentences, for things that basically never happened. And we have to understand this as part of what Glenn Greenwald was talking about in terms of how the law has shifted. We are no longer operating under an equal justice system. This is a way of generating the fear that he talked about that is necessary to maintain the kind of situation that we have. How did it happen? Well, after 9/11, the FBI was charged with preventing the next terrorist attack. And how, after all, does the FBI know who's going to commit a terrorist attack until the attack occurs? And I think the way the FBI solved this, or at least one of the ways, was to start to look at people's ideology, on the theory that ideology predicts criminal behavior. If you pray too fervently at the mosque, if you use jihad and paradise in the same sentence too many times, someone who's listening in will get the idea that maybe you're a danger. There's a 1% chance that you might engage in terrorism. And then you have to be taken down. You have to be locked up to prevent the crime from happening. And that is what preemptive prosecution is all about. It is about prosecuting somebody for a contrived or made-up charge to prevent them from committing a real crime based on their ideology. Have we ever had this kind of experience before? Well, back in the 60s and 70s, we went through a period called COINTELPRO. How many people in this place remember COINTELPRO? All right, this is interesting. I'd love to see 100% of the hands go up, but this is part of what I'm out here trying to do, educate. This was a period of time in which the FBI was concerned that people with strong ideological feelings, Puerto Rican national movement, Indian national movement, Black Panthers particularly, they really wanted them, would be a threat to the stable order. Their actual charge, I think, was to go after any group that had the potential for violence. And if you can imagine, is it possible for the FBI to spin a situation in which almost any group, including a library group or a women's garden club, might have a potential for violence, and they can do that? And then they went after them. They had participated in targeted assassinations, in framed murder charges, in disrupting meetings. I have some of the names here on the board. Until finally in 1976, a church committee in Congress said, look, this has got to stop. Can never happen in a democracy that a government makes war on its own people over the ideology. And they put in place various rules to prevent this from ever happening again. And to some extent the rules worked, that controversial how well, up until 9/11. And after 9/11, these rules came off. And so I would argue that we are now back into the COINTELPRO era. This is a new COINTELPRO, I argue, on steroids. How does it actually work? Well, I say there are three facets to it. I just want to quickly go over them here. One is that the government passed various laws called material support for terrorism laws. And these laws make it a crime to engage or have any contact with certain designated foreign terrorist organizations, regardless of your intent. Even if your intent is to relieve suffering, even if it is to prevent terrorism, it would still be illegal. And just a couple of quick examples of charity. After 9/11, all of the Muslim charities were shut down. Money was taken by the U.S. government, and then they went after the directors on material support for terrorism charges. In the Holy Land Foundation case, for example, they were building schools and hospitals in Palestine, and although the government conceded that no money had gone to any terrorist group in this foundation, the directors were nonetheless convicted of material support for terrorism because the schools and hospitals added to the prestige of Hamas, and that constituted material support for terrorism. And now Hassan al-Awlaki here is spending 68 years in jail, so it's essentially a lifetime sentence for doing essentially compassionate work. There was a group out in the Midwest that decided to engage in peacemaking. They were peacemakers. They went out and they would meet in conflicted areas. Palestine was one. And the government, these are the red guys over there, the government is now going after them on material support for terrorism charges because even though they were meeting with different groups, trying to bring about peace, that was material support for terrorism as well. Another problem is free speech. We all think we have free speech. But I have a number of people up here, Tariq Mahana, Ali Timimi, Shifa Siddiqui. These are people that basically took positions on the internet to the effect that the Muslim countries, and I'm kind of conflating a couple of cases here, that Muslim nations had the right, indeed the duty, to repel foreign invaders and be independent on their own, foreign occupiers, including the United States. That was enough to get them locked up for 20, 30 more years. Al-Timimi is in jail for life in solitary confinement. That is how, and that was from one meeting right after 9/11 when they were talking about what the Muslims should do about the situation. The same problem, they've gone after animal rights activists, environmentalists. The point of these laws is that they are unfair because they criminalize things that none of us think of as criminal, and indeed most of us think of as laudatory. And there is no notice that this is criminal, and so it is a perfect way to ensnare, to entrap people and have them locked up. If you cannot find a way, the government cannot find a way to lock you up on a material support charge, they very often will assign an agent provocateur to go in and try to get you locked up. And one of the ways they do that, I'll just cite a couple of quick examples here. Tariq Shah, famous bass player, for some reason they decided to go after him, and they got a guy who, after several years of trying, became his very best friend, took bass lessons from him, and then finally moved into his house and lived with him for a number of months while carrying around a tape recorder and trying to goad him and talk him into saying enough that could get him convicted. And eventually he succeeded, and now he's spending 22 years in jail. In the Newburgh 4 case, the government offered $250,000 if they would bomb a synagogue. These were the poorest kids you can imagine. Now, the price for bombing a building, I'm sure, is not $250,000. You could probably get it for $8,000 or so in most cities on an arson. But that's not what the government wanted. They wanted a bunch of kids that they could claim were terrorists. And they were willing to pay that amount of money to get these people so they could say, these are terrorists and you better be really afraid. Well, anyway, these are some of the cases, and I have to move along. I just wanted to say something about solitary confinement, because once these people are charged with material support for terrorism, one of the first things that happens is that they are thrown immediately into solitary confinement, pre-trial. Now, you know, under the Geneva Conventions, you are not supposed to keep anyone in solitary confinement for more than 30 days because it's so debilitating. It is extremely painful. There are panic attacks. There is a sense of complete losing of your mind, the ability to talk. As one person said, it is a daily struggle every day to hold on to your sanity. So they're put into solitary confinement, and they're kept there for years. The most famous case was Mohammed Morsami, who ended up in 5.5 years in jail in solitary confinement pre-trial, until he finally said to the government, I can't stand it anymore, I'm going crazy, I will plead guilty to anything you want. And once he pled guilty, they let him out. I could go through some of them more. Once you are convicted, then you often go to a special Muslim prison in the middle of the United States called a Communication Management Unit. It's mostly Muslim, it's not entirely Muslim. But the idea is that it is designed to segregate these people and isolate them so that this ideology will never get out. It will not contaminate the rest of the country. And they're held there, oftentimes in solitary confinement for life, for very long periods of time. And I think the government is putting them there under these very restrictive conditions, hoping that people will forget them. And I have to say that it is the mission of the National Coalition to make sure that none of these people are forgotten, that these cases are remembered. And I've had people that have called me up and said, my appeals are exhausted, I have no place else to go in the legal system, please put me on your wall, I don't want to be forgotten. And that's what we are trying to do. We have programs to follow these families, to make sure the families are all right, that the prisoners are good, that we introduce legislation to get them out, we have educational events, and so on. So thank you.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, great. Thank you so much, Glenn, and to the distinguished panel and this wonderful audience. I'm so glad we're all here to talk about some very serious issues. Now, as Glenn mentioned, these are hard topics to talk about, and they're hard topics to live with. I'm here today. I'm a lawyer. I'm a Muslim. I'm an Arab. I'm an American. I'm a naturalized citizen. And so these issues are very real to me in maybe a different way. And so it's important that we spend some time to talk about them. I do want to tell you that I am my nature is more of an optimist. And so it's hard today after reading Glenn's book, no offense, Glenn, and sitting here and talking and of course I knew all of these things and I know all of these things and I live these things. It's another thing to kind of see it all in one place. And it's hard to do, but I think it's important. And I highly recommend the book, by the way. Are you selling them here? Okay, absolutely. Do that. It's a great book. Read the book. Buy it for your friends. Think about these issues. And while we know a lot of the history that's in there, it's reflected in such a way that really makes you think about it from a different lens. And I think that's really important. So I don't have a lot of time, and I prepared a lot of remarks, so I'm going to just cut a lot of this and really cut to the chase and talk about, we know generally being a Muslim after 9/11, right, over the last 10, 12 years. Before 9/11, there was a small group of us in St. Louis just before, it was actually just a few months before 9/11. We'd sat around and talked about, well, we really need to be more active in our communities. We're Muslims and we should be more present, we should be more aware in our communities, and what can we do? And so we got together and started the St. Louis chapter of the Council on American Islamic Relations. And those were good times, we're young professionals, single, and having a good time. We got t-shirts that said Muslims Care, CAIR, and hitting the highway, and we, built houses with habitat. I mean, it was such a nice, peaceful, fun time. And our theory was very simple, right? If people saw us in the community and saw us contributing, that they would think of us as members of their community, that we would be like them, we would not be foreign or different. And it was a simple theory, and we thought it was going quite well. And then September 11th happened, right? And so our theory just really got flushed down the toilet. We went from, thinking about trash on the highways to dealing with, kids in high schools and elementary schools who are getting beat up, to thinking about, parents who were scared to walk their kids to school, and parents who were losing their jobs, right? Just for being Muslim, right? And actually being overtly Muslim, right? You can look at someone and say, oh, they're Muslim or not Muslim. That was the presumption. And so, we were really, again, we were trying to do very simple things, and there were a couple of lawyers in the group. Really, we had no experience with anything like this, and we were really quite overwhelmed. And so we had to roll up our sleeves and figure out what are we going to do? We have to, our mission, our purpose here has changed. And really, that's what happened to Muslims in this country. We went from being silent and invisible to being hyper-visible. Okay? We can't afford that luxury of invisibility anymore. Little did we know this was a luxury, right? We can't afford that anymore. And so we have to start telling our own story and be a part of a community and culture in a different way. And it's, we weren't raised that way. My parents, I'm an immigrant, my parents are immigrants, we were raised to be quiet. You don't talk about where you're from and what you believe. We want to fit in. And looking at me and my name, it's not that easy. There's some challenges along the way, right? But we tried, and the silence didn't work. Silence is never going to work, right? So it's important to be here and put these issues out on the table. Now, our community is struggling, right, in lots of ways. We have lots of professionals in our community. In terms of socioeconomic class, we have the gamut, right? We have all sorts of professionals. We have people who work in factories, we have people that drive cabs, we have people that really run the gamut in our community. And they're all affected by this. And I think when we're reading your book and thinking about the elitism that's in there, we have this aspect of elitism. If you're educated and you're a professional, no one's going to bother you, right? If you go to your doctor, many of you probably have Muslim doctors, right? Maybe you may know other Muslim engineers and professionals in this society. And so you think, oh, well, I'm not like them. No one's going to come and arrest me for being a terrorist. I save lives. I'm a firefighter. I'm a police officer. I'm a lawyer or a doctor. And that's not the case. History tells us that's not the case. And so we kind of have to educate our own community and say, look, we have to get out there ahead of this. What are we going to talk about? We need to educate the educated about civil rights in this country. They don't understand what can happen to them and what can't happen to them, what they can ask for and what they can't. And so what happens, I think, is a generational gap, there's an economic gap. When you go to these Muslim conferences, and there's lots of different groups that put them on. A big one is Islamic Society in North America. They put a big conference on every year. They typically have a big government speaker that comes in, and I don't want to say dog and pony show, but lots of good, we're here for you, and civil rights. And I think in many respects there are. There's some very high-profile cases where the DOJ and the government has prosecuted and brought cases on behalf of Muslims fighting for. There's a famous case out of Berkeley where a Muslim woman wanted to take off paid leave to go on Hajj, right? And so they brought that case. I mean, the EEOC brings lots of cases on behalf of lots of religious groups. This should not have been a big deal, like, whoa, this is great. This is what they do. This is what we do, defending the Constitution, protecting people's rights, and the right to practice their religion. So some of the controversy surrounding that case was, the government is now interested in enshrining Sharia law into our society, right? So now the federal government has to say, no, we're not here, holding one religious law above another. We're here talking about the protections of religious law overall. So they kind of felt some of the heat that we feel, right? Which is kind of an interesting situation to be in. The federal government, yes, there are some things there are some lawsuits, and so again, I'm an optimist, right? There are some lawsuits that have gone forth on behalf of Muslims. On the flip side of that, of course, you have, you mentioned a little bit about the FBI, the role of the FBI, and some troubling things that have been happening. I don't know if any of you have heard of Operation Flex. Raise your hand if you've heard of Operation Flex. Okay, so thankfully a few of you have, but you can Google, Operation Flex. You can get on Public Radio International. It's This American Life. They did a really wonderful job of documenting sort of what happened in that story. I don't have a lot of time to just give you the highlights, but I do want you to listen to it if you get a chance. And what's interesting is the producer, the person leading the show, kept saying, this is not a typical FBI situation. This is not typical. Saying it's not typical. But then he went on to just, research and investigate and discuss the details of this sort of ludicrous thing that happened. So this is Orange County. The FBI puts large Caucasian man, and this is important for the story, because the story is called Operation Flux for a reason. So you have this large 6'2", almost 300-pound male who's essentially a bodybuilder. Okay, and the FBI brings him in and says, "We want you to spy on Muslims in these mosques in this area." And so he goes in and he converts and he befriends some people in the mosque, and he spends months in this community. And he starts hanging out with a few of the young men. Some of them approach him and say, "Hey, how are you doing? You're a convert. How's it going? Any questions? Call us." Very typical, right? And so he engages these young men and a bunch of single Egyptian men living near the mosque, and they start playing Xbox for hours, and they hang out at night. They eat, they become very friendly. They live this sort of common life together. And as time goes on, he starts bringing up lots of interesting questions. Out of nowhere, he starts saying, "Tell me about jihad. Tell me more about jihad. We should do something. We should do something in this country. What's wrong with this country? We're just sitting here. We're so apathetic." And he starts sort of introducing these ideas. And by his own admission, it's his introduction of these topics. And so one day, he's in the car with two Muslim men and on the way to the mosque, and he says, "I have access to weapons, and I think we need to do something. Let's blow something up." And so these men in the car just like they're stunned, right? They don't know what to do. They can't believe this is happening. This is like a skit. This can't be real. And so they're silent. They get out of the car, and later that day they call the local chapter of CARE, which is Council on American Islamic Relations for Orange County. And that person knows, of course, and works closely with the FBI in Orange County. Calls the officer that he knows in charge and says, "Hey, this is what's happening. We're really concerned about this. Got some information. And this is the situation," describing the fellow and what he said. And the FBI agent goes on for minutes to say, "You know what, I'm so glad you told me about this. This is exactly what our relationship is supposed to be doing. We're relationship building. You're telling us this is important. Thank you for doing this. We really appreciate it." And he says, "Okay, well, I have the fellow's name. Do you want his name? I have his address." He said, "No, I don't need his name." And he said, "What?" Okay, so they got on the phone and come to find out, of course, that this was the informant that the FBI had placed in this local mosque. So he knew exactly who it was. He knew exactly what was going on. And so this community, and this FBI agent had gone to this mosque and several mosques, and this happens in St. Louis. The FBI comes to our mosque, we bring them and say, "Hey, look, here's a friendly FBI agent. Talk to them. If you hear anything suspicious, tell them." And he had gone to this mosque and said, "We are not spying on you. We will not put people in your mosque to spy on you." This was quoted, this was taped, and sure enough, this is what happens. And so it's sort of like a Saturday night skit. It really doesn't seem real to me that this happened. How could this happen? And you talk about impunity, with impunity, right? And so, interestingly, this one, and I see actually the names of one of the young men who was ultimately, Niazi, who was prosecuted. Well, actually, no, charges were brought. He ultimately was not prosecuted. He was released after his life, of course, had been ruined and labeled a terrorist. No prosecution or conviction at all of anyone after almost a year of very intensive interrogation, or very intensive investigation and undercover work by this agent. Okay, so that's really scary. Where are our dollars? I mean, it's scary on many levels. Where are our dollars going? What is the purpose of this type of work? Do we really have a relationship? What's the role of the federal government here? So, on the one hand, we have the federal government. The Muslims really need to think about and understand what their role is and how we play into that. We also have state-level issues, right, which we have to think about. Anti-Sharia laws and legislation, which is ridiculous. I don't have time to deal with right now, but I can certainly talk about and answer questions. We also have mosque building issues, right? A fundamental First Amendment right in this country, right to practice your religion, have a place of worship. Now, all of a sudden, on the municipal level, we're having to challenge, basic ordinances and say, look, you have a mosque across the street. Now, you have a church across the street. I can't have a mosque.
I grew up during the Dirty War in Argentina. For people that know about that, it was when the civil government had the experience of a coup d'etat by fascist military, and that was really painful. And when I see this list here, it comes to me all the wars that we have in names for people. The one that comes to my mind is the Vietnam Memorial in Washington D.C., for instance, with so many lives there. And then talking about the civil war here, so many thousands of people, killing each other for different reasons, And they were all speaking, some of them spoke English, some of them spoke German, and some other languages, but and then looking at this, in my case, is the desaparecidos from Argentina. I'm from that particular time, 1957, 1956, and torture, kidnapping, the people getting, against everybody. These neo-Nazi groups, against Jewish, against gays, against Muslims, against Jews, and they were kidnapping, killing, and torturing those people. They were not against blacks because we don't have many blacks in Argentina. Otherwise, they would be against blacks too. Because it's a sickness of the soul. Racism and all this violence that's going on. So when I hear about all these experiences, the only thing that I could, I survived that one, so I feel lucky that I'm here talking to you right now. But many of my friends are just names. Once in a while I Google them to see if they found the remains, or if somebody, was found in Europe testifying against the general that was convicted, something like that. And like there was a kid here, I think he left. It's a family thing. What happens? The tragedy was Hamoudi's son, our neighbor that he's in federal prison now. He was here, he left. It's a pity, but I was going to recognize him, ask him if he wanted to talk, say something about his own case. But anyway, because many of us, we are aware of this situation with the rule of law, and that the government is, sometimes it seems that it's not what we think that it should be, and things like that. And at the local level as well, when you see certain things that are happening, when the city council meets and they talk about things that bring a lot of controversy within the local population. Sad situations as well, there is always a little bit of racism, classism, and all other isms in between. And, you get into what is called, at least for me, into the survival mode. You have to survive one more day so you can do something good. If you choose that way, you can choose the 8 to 5, go to work, 40 hours a week, or keep silent, it doesn't matter who you pray to or whatever, you do your job and you retire, then you die, and that's it. But some other people, all of a sudden they have an aha moment, perhaps. Some of them have time to write books, some others have time to rebel to their own institutions, some others get the cause of helping certain people. You have no choice, you have to do what you have to do. And for me, since I speak Spanish and English and I come from a Latin American country, I decided to work with our Latino families. And after doing that for many, many years, now we realize, as an organization, for-profit organization, grassroots, that we are serving the entire public, the general public, not only Latino people. We serve the minorities, the underserved, and right now we establish ourselves, we occupy a territory here in the neighborhood, in the first ward, the low-income neighborhood. So we occupy the corner, fix it up. We created a community place, where people can come in and volunteer and help in our programs. We work on health, education, legal access. And talking about legal access, we have a pro bono attorney, we have an immigration attorney that is helping. So since we Latinos sometimes are a problem for the institutions, we look for solutions. So one of our problems is immigration, people that are being prosecuted because of a driving violation. So we decided to be a solution, and we worked hard for 1 year and applied through the Department of Justice to be able to provide immigration services. So that's what we are doing right now. We're helping people, families to be together, and we're helping residents to become citizens. And I think that we are doing a little bit of a good work in that sense. in empowering our community, empowering our people. And because we are a very small organization, so that's what we can do with the resources we have. And we work every day. It's an ongoing thing. And we work with everybody. Everybody wants to work with us. We work with the law enforcement. We work with the local police. We work with the FBI. We work with the immigration services. We did 2 years of anti-human trafficking, working as a community outreach. And right now we're doing health. We're working with the National Partnership for Action to eliminate health disparities. And that's my cup of tea. I'm a nurse, so I should work on health. That's what we are doing. But other things come to us, because of it's a one-on-one individual case. So every different family is a case, and we are working on that. We bring in awareness. And yes, indeed, you need to be very careful in the way that you do things, because it's not a matter of being afraid, but being aware and intelligent enough not to get caught. So, because that's what it is mainly, I mean, you have to do the things that you have to do and survive one more day, because there is somebody waiting for me to notarize the translated birth certificate so they can apply for their kids to take advantage of the latest presidential decree in order to help Latin immigrants, young immigrants that came to this country when they were young, to be able to have employment or just to do something better with their lives and be able to go to college, etc., etc. You are all familiar with this. And one of the things that I'm really proud about our organization is that I love to see our Muslim students from the university coming over and volunteer to help with our after-school program. And it's very nice. I do a little racial profiling. Whoever comes with a scarf on their head, the Muslim, and it's Salam alaikum. Yeah, maybe.
We like that.
Yeah. I mean, I travel. I visited North Africa when I was younger, and I absorbed different cultures, and I was lucky enough to travel a lot. So I bring all that with me. But anyway, one of the ways to look for a solution, I would say, it is a community effort. Every individual should do something every day, but you have to get together with other people, otherwise it takes too long and it's not effective enough, the work. So right now I have 3, 4, a few more friends. Some of them are recognized, some others might become new friends. So that's it. But definitely it gives me hope to see that so many people are here with the common denominator of, yes, we do understand, Glenn, what you are talking about. Yes, we do.
The stalwarts, I'm going to invite Glenn back up. I want to thank our panel for their comments, for adding to the
I was wondering if any of you have received personal threats or intimidation or any other surveillance or anything like that directed at you or your organization that gives you cause for concern.
I shave every morning just in case somebody is filming me. I want to look good.
I can say yes to both of those. The American Civil Liberties Union of Eastern Missouri, my colleague John Chasnoff in the back will attest to the fact that periodically we get threatening mail letters, because the scope of the work that we do, we're inevitably going to offend somebody. Notwithstanding the fact that the protections of the Constitution extend to everybody. Some people don't like that. And personally, relative to my law enforcement past, I have many friends who remain in law enforcement, but you can be sure that there are some people in law enforcement who have, whether jokingly or not, suggested, Glenn would be better without me. So, yeah.
When I was representing the imam
I was reasonably sure, and I think everybody else on the defense team was, that our phones were tapped. I think this is something that is routinely done in terrorism cases, is to tap the phones of the defense attorneys. But I've never been personally concerned about anything happening to me. I've never gotten any threats, in part because I think what Glenn was saying about fear, I mean, the basic product of what this is all about is fear. And we simply cannot give in to that fear. We simply have to just go ahead and do what we have to do. And, you know, I meet new people and I say, is this an FBI agent? Is this guy going to try to talk me into doing something illegal? I don't care. I just got to live my life. You can't give in to the fear, and that's the problem.
And I was just going to say, I think there was one letter, you know, between my husband and I that came to our home, and that was very disturbing. What's more disturbing is the stuff that our clients and friends share with us about what they get in their homes and or their websites, or, you know, really vindictive, hateful type of material. And so, of course, we have contacts with the FBI, so we refer them to the FBI. We don't know what happens after that, but thankfully nothing to speak of.
I would like Glenn Greenwald to comment on what I would consider illiberal uses of the rule of law. It was constantly invoked, for example, by anti-immigrant activists who wanted the president to apply the rule of law to those young people that were eligible for his declining to prosecute deportation cases. I mean, are there bad uses of this concept of the rule of law?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Obviously, if you have a regime of bad laws, then rigid application of law is something that will actually breed greater injustice. And that's the reason why, for example, most political philosophers and I think even Western nations recognize the place for civil disobedience because you don't want to set up this sort of religious sacredness around law, because law itself cannot be an instrument to worsen all of these problems. And so when I talk about the supremacy of the rule of law, I don't mean to suggest at all that simply blindly following legal stricture is the exclusive way that a society can achieve justice, for exactly the reason that you just suggest. But I think that if you go back to what John Adams, the sort of dichotomy that he observed, which is that as a generalized principle, you have only two options. You can either say that you will live in general under law as supreme, as Thomas Paine said, to the extent there's a monarch in America, let a crown be placed on the head of law and declare that law is king. Because the alternative is to have a monarchy or a tyranny or a society where power reigns. And so, there is no perfect and absolute system that doesn't permit deviations, and that includes law. Law can actually be an oppressive regime. But it's the only real alternative to having some kind of ordered and just society.
In the back.
Yeah, Mr. Greenwald, I appreciate your distinction between violation and deviation of the rule of law, but I wonder if you're a little too kind to American history. Think back to McCarthyism, Palmer raids, back to St. Louis, where we had the Dred Scott decision, and the judge said that no black man has rights and the white man has to respect. It seems to me that there has been repudiation of the rule of law throughout our history, and I wonder if the rule of law has just been a thin veneer. And my question is, does it seem different to us now because this is our time and so it's more vivid because of media, or is it because white people have finally followed the second?
Yeah, those are all good questions. I mean, look, I think there is a bias to believing that problems that are contemporary are worse than problems that have taken place in the past, in part because problems that are contemporary are the ones that affect us. So being human, we tend to think that problems that affect us are worse than problems that don't. So there is that bias inherent in how we view history versus contemporary afflictions. And you're absolutely right. I mean, I was very clear about the fact that violations of the rule of law in American history are not ancillary side matters. They're often sort of central to how American history was shaped. They were violent and fundamental breaches, not ones that just sort of were isolated on the side. In fact, the nation was born as a violation of that principle. So I don't mean when I draw this dichotomy at all to minimize or trivialize just how radical those breaches were. Nonetheless, I mean, if you look even at the harshest critics of the United States, both contemporary politics and even its history, most people will agree that the history of the United States has been one of very painful and incremental, though inexorable, progress in lots of these areas. I mean, it just simply is the case that no matter how horrendous conditions are for racial minorities in the United States, it is better than the time 150 years ago when they were owned and sold as chattel. It is indisputably true that if you look at the conditions of women, though far from equal in lots of ways, it is radically better than times when they were denied the right to vote in any other civic right. Certainly that's true for gays, for Native Americans, for lots of different groups. And I think the one thing that explains that social progress, which is far from inevitable, lots of countries have gone backwards in lots of those areas, is that this principle has remained vibrant. That doesn't mean that, I'm not at all suggesting you can't find instances in the past where people, including prominent people on the Supreme Court, rejected the essence of the rule of law. Of course that's the case. But I think its vibrancy is really what animated all of that progress that I just referenced in a way that I think that we've now lost. And so I do think it's a pretty radical difference, but ultimately at the end of the day, like when people go and say, okay, here's the radical difference. This is something that's really bad now, and here's why it's different than in the past. In some sense, it's really just a rhetorical device for getting people to pay attention. You know, for saying, this evil that I'm talking about is new and different, so you should really care about it. Ultimately, I'm not really that interested in whether things now are radically different than they were in the past. What matters to me is, are things now sufficiently bad that they warrant action? You know, it's the sort of thing that you do when you write a book to try and have a hook. Like you say, here's why what I'm writing about is totally new. And I think it is, for the reasons I've said. You may be right, you make a good argument that it's really more of a continuum, the idea of violation and repudiation, rather than this sharp dichotomy that I'm drawing. But ultimately, to me, it doesn't much matter. What matters is that there are these evils in our society that demand redress. And whether it was better or worse 200 years ago or different, doesn't concern me quite as much as being clear about what we're now facing.
Over here too.
I was thinking of John Adams, you know, the man you quoted, the founding father. The Alien Sedition Act, 1798 got passed, a couple people got prosecuted. It's just, there's an H.L. Mencken quote that's just bouncing around my mind. I'm paraphrasing, but it was something about the Supreme Court. They passed some law in like 1912, or it might have been involving Eugene Debs. If you throw out the quote, you have to be a lawyer to misunderstand the law that clearly. And I don't want to point fingers in anyone's face, but it's a fact that if you guys become lawyers, I'm not a student here, but if you become lawyers, you hold power. And you can change people's lives for better or for ill. And I'm just wondering, like, it ends up lawyers always sound like, they almost sound like priests arguing about, you know, how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. Instead, and you have guys like John Yoo and David Addington, whose ideas have become bipartisan. That Obama has taken and escalated. Like Noam Chomsky says, you know, it used to be you just got tortured, now you get murdered by a plane flying in the sky. I mean, just how, like, do you think that's going to change? Like, is there going to be a reformation where people don't talk about angels dancing on the head of a pin?
Yeah, I mean, let me just, you know, I'm interested in what the panel has to say about this, but I want to reference them in answering the question. I mean, basically, if you look at the panel, there's, you know, two lawyers on the panel and someone who just got done working with the ACLU, who have sort of dedicated their lives not to fighting about these kind of how many angels can dance on the head of a pin questions, but to combating these injustices, not in, you know, a 9-to-5 way, but dedicating their lives to doing it, and the organizations they represent have done so at great personal risk and cost to themselves in order to combat them as well. So I think it's important not to overgeneralize, But but what I would say is that there are lots of instances. I mean, one of the things that the founders realized is that these rights that they were guaranteeing would be meaningless if there weren't a whole bunch of checks and safeguards to prevent their erosion. And there are a lot of institutions that are supposed to prevent their erosion which have radically failed. Not just the legal profession, but the judiciary, as I said earlier, the idea of an independent press, the idea that the three political branches would check each other and would prevent any kind of serious transgressions. Lots of them, I'd say almost all of them have failed. But within each of them, there are individuals who have really, at great personal expense, worked pretty heroically to try and to pursue these principles and defend them. And I think it's important to sort of be aware of that, because within those acts lies what I was describing earlier, sort of the hope for optimism, the fact that human beings are capable and obviously are very willing to stand up to these sorts of things and do what's necessary to change them.
I'm sorry, the first thought that came to my mind was, don't put us in the same boat as those.
I know, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay, that's legitimate.
John Hughes is a terrible guy.
Free speech, all good, but just as I say to people about being Muslim, we're not all the same, not all lawyers are the same. We all do different things, we use our skills in different ways, and you could be one of the good guys,
I might just add to Jen what Glenn said earlier about how the courts have seemed to have abandoned their role as the arbiter for how the Bill of Rights and our basic things are supposed to be decided. And certainly as a practicing lawyer, having gone through a lot of these cases, I've been astonished to see the kinds of decisions that come out in which, by twisting words, they make black seem to be like white and justice is injustice and so on.
Making murder respectable, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's very, very difficult. And I think I grew up in a time in which the courts were supposed to be the arbiters of this, between the government and the people. And I've seen that now gone. I don't see that happening anymore, and I'm not sure how to get that back. And I don't know who is the arbiters anymore except you, all of you. And that's why it is so important that we get together, that we talk to each other, that we reject the whole idea of the fear that keeps us from talking to our neighbor and saying something is not right here. We need to do that, and that's why I'm so delighted to see this huge crowd come out here, because it just means so many more people that we can talk to the truth to, unlike the media, and you can go and tell people. So please be very active, do a lot of talking. This is important.
Sorry.
I kind of just want to also piggyback. I heard your question, but he failed to identify himself. That was my colleague, John Chapman, on the previous question on the ACLG. And it was something that I was touching on earlier, too. That's something, I wish I knew exactly how to say, but I think there's something very important about acknowledging that, like I said earlier, I think your talk here this evening was the best I've heard it put about present-day conditions. But there's something about acknowledging the reality that it's nothing new. There's always been, I would argue, a repudiation, to use your word, a repudiation of the rule of law as it affects some people on this soil. And there's something important about our ability to acknowledge that on indicting no one present. We were born into that reality that I think will allow us to begin addressing the kind of thing that you're talking about, which we've seen up close in the most horrific ways. Prosecutorial misconduct that you wouldn't believe. Police abuse that you would not believe with impunity, because there has been this repudiation of the rule of law as applied to certain groups in the country from its inception. It was acceptable, and I think it's very difficult to talk about that because in mainstream settings, it upsets the narrative. That pisses people off more than most patriots get pissed off more than anything else when you upset the narrative of the country. What we are, what we've been, what we aspire to be. When you hit them with the hard evidence of what has actually happened, that's when things go bad. But like I said, I think this generation that is here now, the new generation coming up, in the world that we live in that's become smaller, their interactions have become greater with other cultures from around the world. I think a standard of equally valuing people in every process that we have is attainable if you don't give up the fight.
About 5 more minutes of questions. I know I'm going to, how shall we say, upset a few people because we're not going to get all these questions in, and I apologize for that. So I'm going to start here first. You can go first, and then you can go.
Okay, well, this my question was, could you please comment on the increasing presence of privatized prisons in the United States, and what implications do they have on our country?
Yeah, I think they have a huge presence, a huge impact, and it's true for this reason. If you look at how, did someone not get the question? Is that the question was, what is the impact of the privatized prison industry and the increasing privatization of the prison industry? If you look at how politicians typically make decisions and to whom they listen, to which constituencies, they tend to listen to constituencies that can punish or reward them, and they tend to ignore ones that lack that power. And you see this all the time. There's lots of one-sided debates because only one side of the debate has that power. And that's definitely true when it comes to things like prison reform, reform of drug laws, liberalization of sentencing guidelines. You have a few advocates, like the people here, who advocate for better laws in this regard. But they don't really have lots of institutional power to punish politicians who don't do the things that they want or who do things that they don't like. But on the other side, you have this increasingly powerful industry, the private prison industry, that really is amazing. I mean, like any other business that profits the more customers that they get, the privatized prison industry profits the more prisoners they get. The more of our fellow citizens are put into their cages, the more profit they make. And so one of the things that they are most interested in doing is ensuring that more and more people become their customers, meaning are in prison. And so whenever there is proposed reform of drug laws or penal sanctions or flexibility in sentencing, they pay lobbyists and donate money to lots of members of the state legislatures and federal government to lobby against them. And it's extremely difficult to overcome that because there's no corresponding lobby on the other side urging them to do the right thing. And not only are they blocking these reforms, but they're using their power to expand their power also. If you look at a chart of how many people are in private prisons in the United States, it's just a very steep increase. And beyond the fact that, like when you privatize anything, the only thing they tend to care about is the profit of their shareholders, not the welfare of the prisoners. So people in privatized prisons are suffering from even worse and more oppressive conditions than people in public prisons. They're treated more harshly. It's a horrendous problem, and it's very difficult to figure a way out because there's no constituency. And this is something that's happened in lots of different countries. There's an article in this week's Economist, actually, that is really hard to read about the state of prisons in Latin America. I live in Brazil. Brazil has probably one of the worst prison systems in the world, where there's something like 13 or 14 more inmates in each cell than it was designed for. And this is the problem all around the world as resources are limited and certain resources have to be taken away. People who are either in prison or who are charged with crimes are pretty much the people who are going to be the first to have those resources taken away. And privatizing, putting the people into cages as profit and then making them engage in basically slave labor, it's why Michelle Alexander calls it the new Jim Crow, aptly, is becoming a very severe problem, and it provides its own impetus. It's very hard to fight against it.
Just real quick, 1 out of every 3 at this point, African American males born today, is expected to spend time in prison. We're looking at the commodification of a whole community, particularly those in the urban core who are impoverished. You have an organization called Corrections Corporation of America that is going around the country as we speak. It's hard economic times, not just for individuals, but for governments all over the country. They go to state legislatures everywhere and say, hey man, we can help you balance your budget. We can take away some of your significant costs relative to imprisoning your people. All we ask is that you guarantee us 90% occupancy of those prisons. So and you know, to me, I know who they mean. You know, when I look at the disparities in sentencing, when I look at the severe inequities at every step of the process, I think I know who they mean. I think I know that there's a reason why we think 1 out of every 3 African American males born today will spend time in prison. So I think it has a severe impact on our societal stability. When you attack a segment of your population like that, you're bound to create instability everywhere, ultimately.
Glenn, in particular, struck an optimistic note by citing the original Tea Party, by citing the Occupy movement, and I think by implication, the Arab Spring, so-called. And it's certainly the case that at least in Egypt and Tunisia, one of the most powerful motivators of the people who participated in that was a total lack of economic opportunity. These people were at their wits' end, they were educated, and they had nowhere to go to make a living. And I think you can see that beginning to happen in Greece, in Spain, but not at this point yet in the prosperous United States. To quote Bob Dylan, when they've got nothing to lose. And we're not there yet. Would you comment, perhaps all of you, on the relevance and importance of our economic position in the apathy that appears to affect the average American when confronting the obvious problems that you're all discussing?
Sorry, you mentioned Arabs, so I took an interest there. All right, so when people talk about Egypt, Egypt has 80 million people. And I'm from Egypt originally, so 80 million people, very high unemployment rate. You're right, we have a very high educated community. And actually, if you look at the data, I don't have it with me, very high percentage of the population, highly educated males between ages of like 18 to 25, right? Very dangerous levels of educated males sitting around the streets doing nothing, okay? And having a president who's been in power for many, many years, you know. So it was a series of things. It took a long time, and people think Egypt was the first country to start the Arab Spring, and it wasn't, right? It was just the notoriety and what people think of in this country, Egypt being a leader, and it is in many ways, though it was not the first to rise up, even though its economic situation is horrific. And it's going to take a long time. Democracy for them is going to take a long, long time. Democracy here, we're still having tensions over what is democracy in this country. Do we exhibit those characteristics today? So, you know, will we get to the point of, I mean, it's such a different, you know, the Arab world is so different. You know, here we have sort of the facade, at least, of something. I'm not saying it's good or bad, but some people do have rights in this country, not just the 1%. Others have some rights in this country, and so it's hard when you have a middle class that isn't necessarily targeted in the way that others are to say, well, wait, we should give this up and do something else. That's very hard. And what you lack in Egypt and many of these Arab countries is a middle class. You know, it was 90 and 10, you know, so that lack of middle class, when more and more went to the bottom, I think John or others mentioned this, as you have more people falling into this lower tier, then you can maybe have this rising. I don't see that happening at the same level just because of the history and dynamics of that region.
Yeah, I can just mention, as the head of an organization that's trying to raise money to get relief for some of the people we've got in jail here, I'm struck by how little money there is on the left. It's bad enough fighting the 10 or 20 people that each contribute $1 billion to Islamophobia, the manufacturing of the Islamophobic fears that go on in the country. But it's another thing to also fight them plus the government. And between the two, you're fighting a very heavily well-financed group, and everybody else on the other side is really struggling to catch up. I don't know what the answer to that is, but I'm hoping that one of the things that will come out of this election is the idea that you cannot entirely buy elections. No matter how much money you pump in, there is still enough residual. There is still enough residual integrity in the American people that they will reject this, and that is one of the ways we're going to fight back, is simply in this kind of a forum, getting the word out and having it resonate. And certainly our message is resonating. Everywhere we go, people pick up on it. So it's the only thing I can see is how we fight back against this, because we are not going to get the money.
All right, last question.
Well, you touched on this, but I think it's worth noting that the reason our country is the #1 prisoner of people in the history of this planet, primary reason for the explosion of incarceration, with a disproportionate effect clearly on the poor and minority, is drug prohibition. Do you agree that drug prohibition should be repealed or at least radically reformed?
Yeah, it's interesting. I actually did a study on the one country in the West that has actually decriminalized all narcotics, which is Portugal, and they did it in 2000. And if you just look at pure data, and what was interesting about Portugal was they're a pretty poor country, especially now, but even in 2000, and they had this out-of-control drug problem, and they convened this commission of apolitical experts, and they said, what is it that we can do to arrest these problems? They had drug addicts laying in the street in Lisbon, astronomical rates of sexually transmitted diseases and drug-related deaths, and the more they criminalized, the more they imprisoned people, the worse the problem became. So they actually were desperate, and they said, what is it that we can do? We want you to consider every option, except for full-scale legalization, because treaties bar them from doing that, and they're a small country, so they actually have to abide by treaties. And so they couldn't do that, but they looked at every other option, and what this panel came back and said was, the solution to this problem is to decriminalize. And it was sort of counterintuitive. People thought, well, how can decriminalizing drugs possibly solve the problem of drug addiction and huge numbers of youth doing drugs? Aren't we going to be sending the signal that it's okay? Aren't we going to have turning Lisbon into a drug haven? 10 years later, in every single category, literally, by every metric, it's this astronomical success. It was incredibly controversial in Portugal when it was introduced in 2000. Now there's zero call for the reinstatement of drug prohibition. And the reason that this has happened, and if you go and talk to drug policymakers there like I did, for this paper, what they'll say is that, and it relates to what I was talking about earlier, when you are the government and you are seen by drug addicts and poor communities as being the force that jails them, there is a wall of fear that gets erected between the government and the citizenry. Once you remove that wall, then government officials are able to go into communities and educate them on the perils of drug use, on how to get off drugs. And much more importantly, when you stop spending enormous sums of money on prosecuting and arresting and caging people for drug addiction for what is a health problem, and instead start using that money for drug treatment programs, for methadone clinics, for clean needles, you fix almost every problem related to drug pathology. Once you take out that moral equation, the moral question from the equation, which is drug use a good or a bad thing, drug decriminalization, really legalization becomes the only rational course of action. But the problem is what this gentleman asked earlier about privatization, and the drug criminalization, prohibition, is an incredibly profitable enterprise for lots of different factions, not just the private prison industry, but also for the government. It's what enables the police to go into communities and basically arrest people at will, to do stop and frisk. It empowers too many people in order for rationality to prevail. But it's absolutely one of the core reforms necessary to solve this sprawling penal system.
Like I do, these conversations always hate to come to an end, but inevitably they must. So I thank you for your presence, and I thank our panelists one more time.